Welcome back. So, having introduced some of Kant's moral philosophy, we're now going to change gears and look at Kant's views on epistemology and metaphysics. This is among the most difficult content in modern philosophy. And indeed, I should say, Kant's three critiques are difficult for even professional philosophers to really grapple with. And I think that's especially the case with the content in the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, which he wrote initially in 1781. Because in that work, he really lays out the initial foundations of his entire philosophical system. Please note this little cartoon here, which won't make that much sense right now, I'm going to explain at the very end of this lecture. Now, Kant, of course, said there are three main philosophical questions. What can I know? How should I act? And what can I hope for? What can I know obviously relates to epistemology. How I should act relates to morality. And what can I hope for, you might say, ultimately relates to that part of metaphysics which is concerned with things like the ultimate disposition of the soul, and broadly speaking, with the notion of a kind of moral progress that exists in the world, right? Are any of our actions that we undertake to make the world a better place really going to lead anywhere? Is there any kind of hope for us? Now, Kant's system is called Transcendental Idealism. Today, I'm going to be explaining more or less precisely what that actually means. But the first thing to note is that for Kant, he tries to synthesize or combine different elements of the rationalists and the empiricists. So if you remember, we've seen a conflict, really, between these two great schools of thought. Now, Kant is going to say that the rationalists are partly right in that they say that there are certain concepts that are a priori, certain concepts which give us some kind of foundational knowledge about the world. On the other hand, he's going to say that the empiricists are also right in a certain sense, because the empiricists want to restrict everything that we know to experience. So you might ask, well, how is it possible that you could actually round, or I should say square that circle, so to speak? How could you make the rationalists and empiricists agree on anything? Now, one way to approach this is to make a distinction. There are two possible ways of explaining how the mind relates to some external reality. First point here, of course, is why would you be interested in making that relation explicit? Or why even think that they're related at all? The simple reason that you would want to relate them or think that they're related at all is because we make certain knowledge claims about the world. When we claim that we think cigarettes cause cancer, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that other people exist, that God exists, we're making some kind of claim about an external reality. In fact, even kind of ordinary, if I could call them sort of mundane claims about the world, right? A claim like if I have 7 donuts and you have 5 donuts and we combine them, knowing that we have a dozen donuts, we're making claims about the sort of structure of reality. And we think that those claims are verified by experience somehow. So we have to explain, of course, how the mind can know anything at all. And this is a serious question, given everything that we saw from the skeptic David Hume, whom, by the way, Kant read in translation in round about 1772. And as he says, Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. Kant was originally a Leibnizian. And once he read Hume in translation, he said, this guy's really onto something. And then for the next 9 years, Kant worked on his Critique of Pure Reason, which is to a large extent his response to Hume. Getting back to this question that I posed, we want to know how the mind relates to reality. There are really two ways of doing this. One way is to say that the mind somehow learns what the external reality is. So in this sense, or on this hypothesis, you've got this mind over here, and it's somehow separate from the world. But the mind somehow, through its commerce with the world, makes certain kinds of connections with the world, a la, for example, empiricism, and therefore gets enough content inside the mind to be able to say, okay, I know what end is up. I know the way that the world actually exists. But of course, a problem with this, as we've seen, is that it leaves a lot to be desired. It poses problems for induction, which relates to causality. It poses problems for scientific knowledge. It poses problems for the existence of other minds and God and all these other kinds of things. Now, a second idea here, which is really what Kant wants to suggest, is that the mind somehow constructs a reality that conforms to its own, what he calls, categories and intuitions. And I'll have to explain what those terms mean in what follows. But for right now, just sort of think about an idea like the following. Imagine that reality, as you and I know it, is not some ready-made kind of thing that exists completely independently of us, but rather that reality is something that you and I more or less construct because we wear a certain kind of spectacles or glasses, and nothing that we experience can actually be experienced as it really exists independently of us, because everything has to be experienced through the lenses of, let's call it, our mind. In other words, Kant wants to say that the mind actually shapes our experience of the world in a very profound way. So the world is not a separately existing object apart from the mind, but rather the world is a kind of ideal construction. Now, if that sounds somewhat familiar, that's probably because we saw something similar in Berkeley, the idealist, who says you only have minds and ideas. But there's an important distinction to be made here. Kant doesn't think you can really say anything about this reality that exists apart from the mind. That is to say, we're going to be able to talk about reality as we experience it, but we can't go beyond the limits of our experience. If the mind is somewhat, if the mind originates the world, so to speak, if the world is mind dependent, then we can know it because the mind actually produces it. But we don't know what reality is when we take our spectacles off, so to speak. We can't know reality as it exists in and of itself. Now, by the way, this sort of hypothesis of saying that the mind somehow constructs the world, this is what Kant calls his Copernican revolution, which he names after Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, who did a kind of similar thing in astronomy. He said, rather than assuming that the Earth is the center of everything, let's flip it and imagine that the Earth is not the center, but that the sun is the center. So it's a change of perspective. So let's begin by talking about knowledge, by breaking down knowledge into sort of two broad ideas here, space and time. Now, there are several sections of Kant's critique of pure reason, many sections, in fact. But two of the most important sections are what he calls the transcendental aesthetic, and then what he calls the transcendental analytic. Right away, you can see that Kant loves technical vocabulary. I wish we could avoid using this terminology because I think it might be confusing. However, it's kind of unavoidable because it's rampant throughout Kant's philosophy. So you've got to get used to these terms: a priori, transcendental, aesthetic, analytic, and so on. And there will be many other terms that we have to learn. So what do these two things really have to offer us? Well, in the aesthetic, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today in this lecture, in the aesthetic, Kant is going to try to show that space and time are not independently existing substances or things as Newton thought, but rather they are constructions of the mind which have sort of a priori objective features of their own. The second part, which I'm not going to discuss in this lecture, is what's called the Transcendental Analytic. Now, in the analytic, Kant is not going to talk about space and time, but he's really going to talk about judgments. And he's going to say that judgments require certain concepts, or what he calls categories. An example of this would be something like unity or plurality or necessity or contingency. And we'll get into all of the minutiae about that. The mind requires these essential concepts or categories in order to know the world at all. So that's the analytic. Now, one way that you can sort of think about this is Kant is making a distinction here, which really only exists, I think, primarily in thought, between two sides of sort of the same coin. On one side, with respect to knowledge, we have what Kant calls the sensibility. And of course, that's everything that, say, Hume would identify with, say, impressions. So our sensory commerce, as it were, with what we might call an external reality, subsumes everything into space, if they're physical objects, and time, if they're physical objects, or if we're introspecting, if we just think about our own thoughts in our minds, right, we're still experiencing things, maybe not in space, but at least in time. The other side to this is what Kant calls the understanding. That's the conceptual sort of part of everything. So for example, if I think of an object, right, like, you know, maybe it's a chair, right? That's obviously a very, very bad chair. I failed art, obviously, but there you go. If you think of an object like a chair, the chair obviously is something, or we perceive it as being something, that has certain sensible qualities to it, right? It is in a time sequence, right? How long has the chair existed, right? Who made the chair? How old is the chair? And so on. It also exists in space, right? The chair is to the left of the toaster, but to the right of the microwave, and so on. But equally, the chair is understood as a substance with certain properties or accidents. It has a certain number of legs, it has certain colors, it has a certain weight, and so on. Once you account for all of the sensible qualities of the chair in space and time, and all of the concepts or categories that we subsume it under, substance, accident, whatever, cause and effect, you've explained what the chair is. So these are sort of the two halves to Kant's great sort of system here. But today, we're really going to only focus on this first part, the aesthetic. And to do that, we're primarily going to focus on his analysis of space. Okay, so in what Kant calls the metaphysical exposition of space, which is in the first part of the Transcendental Aesthetic, Kant gives 4 arguments, and then at the end he kind of tacks on sort of a different related argument that I'll talk briefly about. And these arguments are supposed to show that space does not exist as an object outside of our experience, but rather is a condition for the way that we actually experience objects as they appear to us. Put another way, space is a sort of mental construction in some way. So the quote here is as follows: space is not an empirical concept that has been derived from outer experiences. So straight away you can see that he's denying space is a concept that we could get from our experience of, say, impressions, as Locke or Hume might say. We continue. Here is why. So here's his explanation. When I relate some of my sensations to something outside of me, i.e. to something in a spatial position different from mine, and also when I relate them to things that are outside one another, not merely as different, but as in different places, I must be already representing space as the ground of the other representations, i.e. as the framework or background or setting within which these spatial relations can exist. So the representation of space can't be obtained through experience from outer experience. Okay, so what does he mean by this? Well, consider that we have a person, and this person exists somewhere in space. Now, in order for this person to have some awareness, some knowledge of himself in space, and by knowledge, I don't mean in order for him to know that he's in Akron, Ohio, as opposed to Antarctica or on the moon. I mean rather, in order for him to have any kind of physical relation to space at all, in order to be able to experience himself as a coherent, let's call it object or substance, in a world of outer appearance, as Kant says, he has to have some awareness of space outside of him and his location relative to other objects in space. So he has to be able to situate himself within what Kant would call a framework or a background. You might think of this as a kind of grid system, so to speak, within which a person or an object is located in space. So for instance, right now I'm sitting down at a table, and without really even attending to this, I'm of course reflecting on this right now, but part of my kind of ordinary awareness of myself in space divides into things like, okay, there are objects to my left and to my right, and there's an up and there's a down, and I have some kind of awareness of my relation to many objects in space. Like there's a door that's about 1.5 meters to my right side, there's a wall that's, relatively close to my left shoulder, and et cetera, so forth. There's a roof above me and what have you. So I exist inside a world in which there are all these objects, right? I mean, these objects might include, things like trees, right? There might be, cats and dogs and other kinds of objects, right? How is that possible, right? The typical way that an empiricist would explain this would be to say, well, we obviously start off and we have certain kinds of impressions of things which we somehow later organize into a whole space, right? So an empiricist might say we have an experience of like a little bitty space like there, or here, or maybe over here, or over here. And then through some kind of additive process, we just kind of add up all of those little bits of space, and we get this big kind of more or less infinite space, right? That makes up space as a whole. But Kant says, no, that can't possibly be what happens. And here's why. Because in order to be able to orientate myself in space at all, in order to be able to experience a particular space, I have to relate myself as a particular position in space to that other particular position in space and all the other positions in space. And I can only do that if I already have what he calls an intuition of space as a whole. So space, in other words, is a kind of entire mapping system, so to speak. You can't understand any particular part of space or location within it or coordinate within it without already having the whole. You can't get the part of the map without having the map itself. So in this way, he wants to say, okay, it looks like in order for me to have any experience of things outside of me at all, tables, chairs, doors, up, down, left, right, I must already have some awareness, not really of a concept, but of a thing, so to speak, that I am part of, a kind of entire infinite fabric that we call space. Now here's a second idea. Space, he says, is a necessary a priori representation which underlies all outer intuitions. So by a priori he means something that's universal and necessary, something that, if you were to think about any kind of object, like certainly any physical object, we'd have to think about it as something that's extended in space, wouldn't we? I mean, Descartes says as much when he talks about corporeal substance, when he talks about the wax. Now, he goes further and he says, we can't construct a representation of a state of affairs in which there isn't any space, though we can very well have the thought of space with no objects in it. So we have to regard space as a precondition for the possibility of appearances, not as a conceptual construct out of them. Space is an a priori representation that necessarily underlies outer appearances. So think about this. We have this intuition, as he says, this kind of immediate grasp of a sensible object that we identify in English with the word space. Now, you can imagine space containing different sorts of objects, right? Actually, I had some various objects right here, but they're not actually showing up appropriately. But let's just imagine, right? You know, you have like a golf ball, and you have, you know, all the, like maybe a Christmas tree or a house, and all these other kinds of objects, and so on and so forth. Now, he says you can imagine space not having any objects in it whatsoever. Now, I think if you're a Leibnizian, you're going to say that's not really true, because space is only a relation. If you get rid of monads, if you get rid of substances, you have no space. But Kant is, as I said before, not really a Leibnizian, although he originally was heavily influenced by Leibniz, and in particular, a German Leibnizian by the name of Christian Wolff. But, be that as it may, he's not a Leibnizian now when he writes the Critique. So he's going to say, hey, look, you can imagine that you get rid of all of these different kinds of objects in space, right? But can it go the other way? Can you actually get rid of space itself? Well, no. I mean, imagine that I think of, you know, say a tree existing somewhere. So there's the tree, okay? Now, I can obviously imagine a different object existing where the tree exists. I could imagine a car, or I could imagine a building, and so on. But notice what happens. If I take away the tree, right, I don't take away the space that the tree occupies. I can think away any object in space. I can think away all objects in space, so that I only have this huge spatial container. How huge? Well, I guess it would be infinite. However, I can't get rid of the space itself. So space is not really an object in the way that, say, a tree is an object, but space is a condition for any object that exists in a physical space. This is why he says space is an a priori representation. Space is itself something that always is presupposed by anything in outer appearance. So you can't get rid of space, but you can get rid of any particular contingent object in space. Okay, so this one's a bit longer, and it's more technical in a way. Third idea. Kant says the representation of space isn't a discursive or general concept, but rather a pure intuition. As a start on seeing why, note this: we can only represent a single space. Any talk of many spaces is always understood to refer to parts of the one unique space. So, for instance, if I think of Antarctica, which I mentioned before, and I think of Akron, Ohio, or I think of Canada, or I think of Australia or France. It's not that these exist. I mean, they're different spatial locations, right? But they're not different spatial locations in radically different spaces. You could, I mean, to prove that, you could ask a question like, well, I know these are different spaces, but is there a way that if you got on an airplane, or if you walked a long distance, or if you got in a helicopter, or whatever, you got on a train, that you could eventually go from point A to point B to point C, wherever your terminus happens to be? And the answer is yes, and that's because it's the same map, folks. It's the same space. So when we talk of many spaces, it's always understood as basically limitations of a single unique space. They're all parts of the same space. He goes on, and space isn't an upshot of the assembling of these parts, right? So space is not a whole that's made up of an aggregate of individual parts, with the parts coming first and the whole arising out of them. We've already mentioned that in argument number 1. On the contrary, our only thought of the parts is of them as in one space. So if I think of an individual space, I always think about it as a limit or a part of a much larger space. Space is essentially single. It is only by marking out boundaries within it that we get complexity in it, and that's also how we get the general concept of spaces or of a space. Thus, all our spatial concepts have underlying them an a priori intuition of space. Similarly, all geometrical propositions that two sides of any triangle are together greater than the third never come from general concepts of line and triangle, but rather are derived from intuition, and indeed derived a priori with absolute certainty. So what he's saying here then is that, yes, you and I can have a concept of space in general. The very fact that I'm talking about space right now suggests that space can be treated as a concept. But space itself is initially, and for the most part, not itself a concept. It's not part of the understanding initially. It's rather part of the aesthetic. It's part of the sensible experience we have of the world. A concept like dog, so there are two little doggies, is made up of individual instances of dog. So if I think of dog, right, dog itself is not a single thing. Dog is, if you will, a collection of different characteristics. Being a canine, maybe having, 4 paws, maybe having a coat of fur, a nose, and these kinds of things, maybe having certain DNA, and so on. Maybe having a certain lifespan, which would, get us into the weeds, talking about how long dogs live and specific species and all those other kinds of things. Anyway, if you think of the concept of dog, if you sort of divided up the concept of dog into, different parts or whatever, it's not like you're taking a single dog, right, and sort of, ripping it apart, which would be, of course, very, very mean, right? Because dogs are just individual members that instantiate or fall under a concept called dog, right? So in that respect, right, a discursive concept, as he calls it, right, is really a concept of something that exists as, instances, as examples that illustrate a concept. But that's not what happens in the case of space. He says space is not made up of individual instances that illustrate it, but space itself is made up of parts that all fall under the same individual space. So put another way, space is almost like sort of a single kind of entity or substance, right? And all the parts of space are just kind of parts of the fabric of space. If you got rid of one of those parts, there'd be something missing from space, so to speak, which would be a bit weird. But if you think about a dog, that doesn't happen, right? The concept of dog in general, just because a particular dog comes into existence or goes out of existence when it dies, doesn't actually change the concept of dog. So space is not really a discursive concept. It's a pure intuition. Now, one sort of note here on the term pure. By pure, he means something like a priori. He means something that cannot be derived from our experience of the world, but must be presupposed in order to explain our experience of the world. So when he says that in order to orientate myself in space, I already have to have the whole of space sort of in my ken or in my awareness, that's a pure intuition. It's not an intuition that is based upon some empiricist aggregation of individual spaces I experience. Fourth idea here. He says space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. So I asked this before, how big is space? Well, it should be infinite, logically. There's no way, he says, of thinking a concept as containing an infinite set of representations within itself. But that's how space is thought. For all the parts of space, even to infinity, are simultaneous. So the basic representation of space is an a priori intuition, not a concept. So again, a couple ideas here. If you think of the idea of a dog, the idea of dog you can think of without thinking of every individual dog. And just because individual dogs go in or out of existence, it does not change the concept of dog. But if you think of, right, space, you're thinking of something that has an infinite magnitude. It's really a single entity that has an infinitely dividable structure in all directions. So unlike a concept like a dog or number or tree or whatever, space is always given as a whole to us, but it's not just it's not like a whole apple, which is a finite thing, but it's a whole infinite container, right? Rather than a concept that just has possible instances that logically fall within it. Now, I said that Kant sort of tacks on another argument here. And this is in the follow-up section, which he calls the Transcendental exposition of space. So the first section was called the Metaphysical exposition. The Transcendental exposition is what follows. By a transcendental exposition, Kant means something like, if we accept that we have certain kinds of knowledge about the world, we can explain why we have that sort of knowledge by referring to certain, what he calls transcendental conditions of either the understanding or the sensibility. So in this case, think about geometry. Now, he did reference geometry in, I believe it was the third argument we just looked at, but it was sort of a passing reference. He goes into it in more detail here. So he says geometry provides a priori knowledge of space. So an example of this is, if you look at this particular picture here, this picture is a picture of two parallel lines. Now, in Euclidean geometry, we're told that two parallel lines will never meet because they're parallel to each other, and so they could go infinitely in either direction. And if they're perfectly straight, then they're not like on the same flight path, so to speak, so they'll never meet. And then, of course, we know other things, right? We know that the interior angles of a triangle will measure to 180 degrees, that two right angles, make 180 degrees, right? They're 90 degrees apiece. If you think about it, almost probably any problem in geometry where you're doing proofs, which are deductively valid, shows that we have some kind of a priori knowledge of space. I mean, that's really what geometry comes down to. I mean, it's geo is earth and metry means measure. So you're literally doing calculations based upon the measure of the earth, right? You're doing right angles and triangles and planes and 3D figures and all these other kinds of things. Now, how is it possible? So think about that question that we asked before. How is it possible that we can actually have a situation where the mind has universal and necessary, that is, a priori knowledge of an independent reality? The simple answer is it's not an independent reality because mind creates that reality, right? So how do we know that reality will always conform to geometric principles? How do we know that geometry always applies to appearances, right? And Kant says that's because space is not a thing that exists independently of us, but is rather only an appearance that we impose on reality. Now, there is, of course, a significant problem with this part of Kant's analysis, because as many people have pointed out, in Kant's day, geometry was, of course, Euclidean geometry. This is the geometry of, the parallel lines, the straight lines and planes and so on. However, there are now various types of geometry, right? Since, I believe, the mid-19th century or so, you have non-Euclidean geometry. So non-Euclidean geometry deals with things like curved space. Now, if space is curved, and you could also relate this to other kinds of things, for example, you think in relativity theory, right? The idea that gravity distorts space. that space is somehow not perfectly flat, that it's bent or curved and what have you. In a non-Euclidean context, right, if given enough duration in space, so to speak, given an infinite duration, right, because the lines in space are themselves curved. Parallel lines, if left to their own devices, so to speak, if they continue infinitely, they eventually will merge. So that seems to contradict, in fact, it does contradict what Kant would say about geometry, because he looked at Euclidean geometry and he said Euclidean geometry applies to the external world, and we obviously know it applies because, it's a priori knowledge. But non-Euclidean geometry would suggest that Euclid is not universally valid. It's only valid given certain assumptions. So how do we evaluate this? Well, some people think that this means that Kant is wrong. We don't actually have a priori knowledge of space at all. However, I think it's worth noting that he only references geometry in passing in that third argument. In the other arguments really are not tied to the notion of geometric knowledge. Second idea here is, it seems to me that maybe Kant just kind of misidentified what we mean by geometric knowledge, right? I mean, how was Kant supposed to know that you could come up with non-Euclidean forms of geometry? So you could say whatever the true or correct geometric understanding of the world is that a priori? Because if that is, then the assumption that space is not a thing in itself, but it's rather a construction of the mind, would help to explain that. So Kant may have just misidentified what the correct geometry actually is. I suppose another thing that you could say, I don't know if Kant would actually say this, is yes, it is possible for us to kind of imagine cases in which Euclid is wrong. But the way maybe that we experience the world is largely through a kind of Euclidean lens anyway. So maybe, right, it's not such a devastating criticism. Now, Kant actually does a similar thing for time. In fact, if you look at his Transcendental Aesthetic, he gives basically the four same arguments that I mentioned before for space. So for example, he says you could think of an object that exists in time. So you have, say, a book that, I don't know, maybe it comes off of a printing press, and that book exists at a particular time. But you could imagine a different book that was that came into existence rather than that particular book. I mean, maybe instead of on a particular day producing the King James Bible, we produce, I don't know, another copy of Huck Finn or, Danielle Steele or some other kind of book or whatever, or some other sort of object. Which is another way of saying that we can think about different objects in time, but we can't think away time itself. So time, in other words, is supposed to, again, be a priori. Now, if you look at the Transcendental Aesthetic, what Kant actually ends up doing is, in the case of space, he gives four arguments in that initial section. In the case of time, though, he actually gives 5 arguments, which is why he kind of numbers them differently. And the third one, what he numbers the number 3 in his treatment of time, is actually a little different than his analysis of space, which is why I'm including it here. So he says, the possibility of apodictic, by apodictic he means certain, principles concerning the relations of time, or of axioms of time in general, is also grounded upon this a priori necessity. That is to say that time, like space, is not a thing in itself. It's something that we just kind of experience as a whole time or as a whole object. Time has only one dimension. Time's arrow goes from the past to the present to the future. Tick, 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 tick. Different times are not simultaneous, but successive, right? So remember, with space, he said all the parts of space exist at once. Not so with time. So, the past is not the same as the present precisely because they don't coexist. So they're successive, just as different spaces are not successive, but simultaneous. These principles, he says, cannot be derived from experience. Why not? Well, because experience would give us neither strict universality nor apodictic certainty. Put another way, how do we know that time is such that there's only one time, and that time will always flow from the past into the present, into the future? How do we know that there couldn't be two different time sequences, or that there couldn't be times that rather than being successive, they're simultaneous, and so on? The answer is because time itself is not a thing that exists outside of us that we get an awareness of and knowledge of through our limited sensory experience of the world. But rather, in order to experience anything in time at all, we have to presuppose time. I mean, think about it, right? If you think about when we started this lecture, this experience of this particular slide is part of a time sequence. You're thinking about it in terms of a before and maybe an after. You can only do that if you already have some idea or some experience of time as a whole. And of course, that's infinite, right? Because you can't really imagine time actually ending. Because the logical question would be, okay, if time ends at 12 noon on a Thursday, what happens at 12 noon and 1 second? So you can't do that. And equally, it works backwards, right? If you think of time beginning in 1940 as an example, what about 1939? Oh, well then again, what about 1938? What about the Big Bang? Well, what happened before the Big Bang, and so on. So he says, it's no good deriving time, our awareness of time, our knowledge of time, from experience. Experience in time or of time presupposes that we have a priori knowledge of time already. So he says these principles are valid as rules under which alone experiences are possible, and they instruct us in regard to experiences, not by means of them. So think about something even as simple, right, as Descartes' wax experiment. That's a time sequence, isn't it? We can't even make sense of an object like the wax changing without having it subsumed in a temporal sequence. And to do that, you already need time. So it seems then, according to Kant, that time has its own sort of scientific knowledge associated with it, which is a priori. Now, if you think about that then, what Kant is really saying here is something like the following. The objects that you and I experience, we only can experience because they conform to certain basic conditions that our mind requires or imposes on them. Now, have we covered the categories in the Transcendental Analytic yet? No, we're not doing that in this lecture. But minimally, we've seen that space and time seem to be a bit like, let's call them glasses or spectacles. And just like when we look at the spectacles here and we see that the spectacles have a certain, in this case, a kind of rose-colored tint. And because of that, all objects in the world conform to that sort of tint, if you will. In the same way, Kant wants to say space and time are a bit like a kind of colorization, or a tinting, or a way of organizing objects. Now, are those objects in and of themselves, apart from our awareness, in space and time? Kant says no, they're not really in space and time. They can't be in anything like the space and time that you and I experience. The space and time that you and I experience are valid for appearances, the way the world appears. We don't really know what reality is when we take those spectacles off. So that means then that these principles are valid for all experience. And so they're objectively valid, right? We can say that any object that we experience is going to be experienced at least in time, and any physical object we experience will be experienced in time and space. But here's the rub. Kant says they only apply to appearances, or what he calls phenomena, not to the things in themselves. And the word that he uses for a thing in itself is a noumenon, which is the singular, or noumena, which is plural. And that comes from the Greek word nous, which means mind. So we can try to think about things in themselves. We obviously speculate about them, but he says we have no knowledge of these things. So what does transcendental idealism actually give us? To say that things are transcendentally ideal is to say that the world conforms to the conditions of the mind, so it's ideal. But these themselves are just transcendental conditions. They're limiting concepts, if you will. They don't tell us the way things actually are in and of themselves, but they just tell us the way things are known by us. Put another way, we know objects because they're known by us. We don't know them apart from our relation to those objects. So remember, there were two possible hypotheses here by way of which we would relate the mind to the world. We've seen then that according to Kant, if you try to explain our awareness of things like time and space, at least, in terms of option one here, you're going to fail because you can't actually reconstruct time and space out of our limited awareness of the world. They are a priori presuppositions of our awareness of the world. Therefore, option two, as I've called it, must be correct. That Copernican option that says the mind somehow constructs a reality that conforms to its own categories and intuitions. So we've seen these sensible intuitions, that's space and time. We haven't seen, though, the categories. That's, of course, what we have to cover in our subsequent lectures. But notice, because the world is mind dependent, because the mind shapes our experience of the world, we can know it. And therein lies Kant's ultimate answer to Hume. Hume didn't think that we constructed our awareness of the world in this sense, but rather, according to Hume, our awareness of the world through these kind of haphazard connections to different impressions, and those produce different kinds of ideas and so on. That gives us a kind of view of reality. But that view of reality is an aggregate. It's just made up of little itty-bitty bits of sensible experience. For Kant, by contrast, our experience of the world is much more robust. We can only experience objects in space and time, at the very least, if we already have some kind of mental machinery already, some spectacles or some programming through which we process the raw information, right, the raw data of the world. So that's how ultimately he's going to try to respond to Hume. Now, I, of course, realize that this is a lot, so you may have questions, but before we go, remember I mentioned this little cartoon before, okay? So Kant tries to show space and time are constructions. That's the aesthetic. And he tries to show, and this is the part that we haven't looked at yet, he tries to show that that certain concepts or categories are necessary for understanding the world. Remember my example of the chair. Once we think of the chair in space and time, we still have to think of the chair as what exactly is it? Is it an event? Does it necessarily exist? Or is it a contingent fact about existence? Is it a substance? Is it an accident? And so on. Now this cartoon, which is in German, it says Kant's Denkhaube, which would be, like thinking cap. And notice we have at the bottom here, you have die Kategorien, the categories. And then within that, you probably can't see that, we have what will turn out to be 12 categories, including things like substance, possibility, and so on. Above that, you have Raum, space, and Zeit, which is time. So the idea here is something like the following. Kant thinks he's laying out the very foundations of the way that the mind actually operates. If Kant were a computer engineer, for example, he's laying out the operating system and the sort of software package that the mind requires in order to know the world. Now, what that's going to give us is something like the following. Imagine that this were the mind, this little eyeball here, kind of like the example of Johnny Test that I used before. the guy that I sort of superimposed in a spatial kind of relation to everything else. In order to have experience of anything, obviously, you can't just be in total darkness, right? You need, and I'm taking darkness here figuratively, as well as literally. You need, in other words, a kind of scaffolding. You need a coordinate system. You need a programming or operating system. So where are we? So say you see a particular object like a car. Where are you? I apologize for the little Pac-Man guy here. It's just sort of part of the image I was able to borrow from the internet, but you can ignore that, unless you like Pac-Man. But it's not part of the lesson here. In order to understand where that object like the car is, you need to have space, minimally. Now, it will turn out you need more than this, as we'll see. And then maybe you have other objects, right? In order to situate those objects in space relative to our position in space, you need space as a kind of whole magnitude, as an intuition. And then, of course, we have relations between these objects, right? One car hits the other car, and so on, right? In order to do that, in order to explain that, obviously you need to understand things not just in space, but in terms of a temporal succession, i.e. in time. What we haven't seen, though, so far is the categories, right? What's left over? Well, those are all those things in that Denkhalbe, right? The thinking cap. You've got substance, accident, cause, effect, right? Now, according to Kant, though, we can know this world in space and time through the categories, but we can't really know objects that exist outside of us apart from our awareness of them. That's the noumenal realm. So in a way, what Kant is going to be doing here is he's going to be limiting our knowledge about the world to the world itself. But that's going to come with the following price. Yes, we can know the world. Yes, we can do science. Yes, he says we can find an answer to Hume. But the price is that we can't actually do metaphysics. We cannot find a way of proving things on the basis of metaphysical speculation. So that will include things like God and freedom and things like the origin of the world, right? So cosmology as a kind of speculation can never provide scientific certitude. Now, as I said before, this is quite a lot. So please email me with questions. But remember, we still have to cover the categories. And there you have it, the world of phenomena. So we can know phenomena, but not noumena.